1, 2, 3. This is a 2025 Framus Hootenanny, a reissue of an exceptionally rare guitar that Beatles fans have been wanting for just decades now. John Lennon and George Harrison played this guitar all throughout 1965. It's featured on their album's title song, Help, as well as the You've Got to Hide Your Love Away sequence in the movie, and it was also used during the recording of Rubber Soul. So in this video, we're going to do a deep dive on this guitar. We're going to find out if these reissues stack up to the originals. And before I start, I have to make a quick disclaimer. So remember in my recent video where I said that the only time that you'd hear me do this is if one of these manufacturers actually sends me a guitar to review. So I can't believe I'm actually saying this, but it actually happened. A few months ago, I sent an email to Framus and I told them how cool it was that they were reissuing this guitar and that when it came out, I was going to buy one and I would love to do a deep dive and use them for sort of historic resources, old brochures and archival documents, stuff like that. The president of Framus Warwick himself, Hans-Peter Wilfer, actually responded personally, and it turns out that he had seen my Rickenbacker, Hofner, and Gretsch videos, and they were impressed, so they asked me to send over an outline of what I had in mind for the video. So I did. To my absolute surprise, Framus generously offered to send me a guitar of my choice to do this review, and of course it was this one, which is the FR 05024 12 VNN SSM. I know that's kind of a mouthful, but basically this is the natural finish one in nitrocellulose. That would be the closest one to the Beatles model. Thank you so much to everyone at the Framus team for their incredible generosity, and I mean that sincerely. And to my regular viewers, you know that something like this has just never happened to me before. So that being said, I am going to do an unbiased review. We're going to break down every feature of this guitar, and we're going to find out if these Framus Hootenanny reissues compare to the originals. All right, let's get started. Okay, Chapter 1. We're going to do a brief background on Framus. So Framus has their roots in Germany, Bavaria specifically, and their company's founding actually dates back to 1946. You may be curious why a German company has a somewhat anglicized name like Framus. It's actually a combination of two words though. It stands for Franconian Musical Instruments Manufacturer, Franconian of course referencing their Bavarian roots in the region. By this logic, it should probably technically be Framus, but I'm not going to say that for the entire video. So by the 1960s, Framus guitars had become pretty popular with working-class European musicians. They were affordable, good quality, and most importantly, available. Arguably Paul McCartney's first guitar, although it was probably his dad's house guitar, was a Framus 5.1 parlor guitar, and it's very likely that some of the Beatles' early hits were even written on this instrument. McCartney's first main guitar that was truly his own was also a Framus, a 552 Zenith or Zenith depending on how you pronounce it, number 17. In addition, you can also spot several other prominent 60s musicians playing Framus instruments. Bill Wyman, the bass player for the Rolling Stones, is a very prominent example who actually played two varieties of the Framus 5150 Star bass. Now, as I mentioned, these Framus guitars were very popular with sort of working-class musicians because they were very affordable. You may remember in a previous video I talked about the Beatles J160Es and how they were extremely expensive. Just over 160 pounds actually, which is around $4,700 in today's money. Now, on the flip side, one could get this Framus for 43 pounds, which is more like $1,200 in today's money. So pretty much a quarter of the cost. Now, to be clear, Framus did have a specialized workshop for very high-end guitars, but it was their general affordability with models like this that made them the #1 manufacturer of musical instruments in Western Europe by the 1960s. Chapter 2. Let's do some context for the Hootenanny. Alright, so in the 1960s, Framus produced a few different styles of these guitars with different features. And while it's often been reported that they sold 3 different varieties, they actually offered 4 models. The Campus King, the Hootenanny, the Folk, and the Folkmeister. All of them came with a spruce top, but there were some differences between them. The Campus King, sometimes referred to as Camping King in advertisements, was the least expensive. It had a maple body and sides and a fairly plain sound hole. The Hootenanny was sort of the middle option with the nicer mahogany back and sides as well as a deluxe rosette around the sound hole. And just for completion's sake, they also produced a jumbo version of this called the 5097 Folk that everyone forgets about, also with mahogany back and sides. Or they had the top-of-the-line 5099 Folkmeister, or Folkmaster, which was similar to the Hootenanny but ditched the nice rosette for premium rosewood back and sides. All 4 had 6 and 12-string versions, and they came standard with a sunburst finish, or you could pay a little bit more and get a natural top. Fun fact, I was debating on whether or not to include this part, but I think you guys will find this interesting. The 0 after the slash in the Framus model system used to mean 12-string, so if you think about it, the 5/24 without the 0, by that logic, there should be a 6-string version of that guitar. And it turns out that the Framus 5/24 Barcelona is basically a Hootenanny. It even has the same rosette, except it's a 6-string classical guitar. So you may also be wondering why a German company even decided to produce American-style folk guitars in the first place. Well, according to Dr. Christian Hoyer, who wrote 2 Framus books, Framus Built in the Heart of Bavaria and Framus the Vintage Instruments book, he told me that Framus actually dabbled with folk instruments as far back as 1958. But at some point during the early 1960s, a subsidiary known as PMC, the Philadelphia Music Company, set up a workshop in Limerick, Pennsylvania, where several guitar manufacturers from around the world met up and exchanged ideas and techniques. Framus sent over Willie Fritcher, who would later work at Guild, and he likely learned a lot about American folk instruments. The first Framus 12-strings were presented at the Frankfurt Fair in 1964, and the rest is history. John Lennon acquired his 1964 model 12-string Framus Hootenanny in 1965, and his was the natural version. It saw use in both the Help movie as well as in the studio, where George Harrison also played it. You really only hear this guitar throughout 2 albums, Help and Rubber Soul. That would be because towards the end of 1965, Lennon gave this guitar away to none other than Gordon Waller of Peter and Gordon, and it can be spotted in photos amongst the duo around the same time period. After this, though, it was given to a manager and sort of disappeared. Turns out, as is weirdly always the case with these things, it sat in an attic for 50 years, and it was rediscovered in 2024, where it was promptly auctioned off and sold for close to $3 million to someone who has way more money than I do. Perhaps Framus realized the interest in this guitar because it is one of the few Beatle guitars that has never seen a reissue and is otherwise out of reach for most players. So now it's 2025, and Framus is producing the Hootenanny again for the first time in decades. So there are some differences between these reissues and the originals. First, it's not handmade in Germany, it is factory produced in China. Don't let that scare you though, modern manufacturing techniques have really come a long way over the years, and if you've watched my channel before, you'll know that I have no problem playing guitars made overseas. What I do care about is how it plays and how it sounds. So while Framus did send this guitar to me for my review, if I'm being completely honest, I was gonna buy one anyway, so let's see how well these Hootenannys stack up to the originals. Chapter 3, Reissue Comparison. So let's start by going over some of the features of this guitar and what makes it unique in the first place, as well as some of the rare variations on 60s Framus models that have been faithfully reproduced here on this reissue. In addition, though, we're also going to talk about some of the differences between these reissues and the originals, specifically the Beatles model, because yes, I realize that is the one that everybody wants to hear about. I also want to thank Perry Stanley for providing his help with this section. You know the Hootenanny in Andy Babuch's book, Beatles Gear? That's actually Perry's, and it's pretty much identical to John Lennon's. I highly recommend you check out his video on the Hootenanny as well for even more specs and features on the originals, and I will put a link to that video in the description. You know the drill. Top to bottom, starting with the headstock and the neck. The wood is mahogany. The tuners themselves are 6 in line, and they are sealed Kluson types, which is a somewhat modern improvement. The originals, however, had open gear style tuners on a strip, which are not easy to find these days. While I personally would have preferred the more retro style, this isn't something that you'd really notice unless you were looking at the backside of the guitar. The tuning buttons themselves are a vintage butterbean style, which is my preferred shape, although I will say that the originals were much more rectangular and had a sort of unique chiclet shape to them. The truss rod cover on this reissue is made of brass, but it's worth pointing out that Lennon's guitar had a black truss rod cover. That being said, this isn't necessarily incorrect. Other Framus models from the 60s have a brass cover too, and some even have this globe logo as well. And also, minor detail, while promotional photos show these truss rod covers attached with just one screw, I am happy to report that these production models use 3 screws to attach the cover, so if you do have a custom truss rod cover made, you should be able to get a nice drop and fit without having to drill any extra holes. Like the originals, we have a bone nut, and the nut width on the 12-string version is 50mm, exactly like the originals. Another distinctive feature, a 0 fret, has also been reproduced here on these reissues. One minor difference is that the originals had a scarf joint connecting the headstock and neck, where on these reissues it appears to be a solid one-piece neck. I'm not sure either is particularly better than the other, it's just a difference that I thought I'd mention. Also, the grain pattern on this mahogany is absolutely stunning. The fretboard and neck are actually really unique as well, because when it comes down to it, this is a classical guitar neck, which means 2 things. 1, it is super wide, and 2, it has no radius whatsoever. What I mean by that is that the fretboard is dead flat. It has no curvature, which makes it very unique to play, almost kind of like you're playing a classical guitar. And in fact, some variations in the 60s even had headstocks with traditional classical guitar slots. The fretboard itself is rosewood, like the original, and there are no inlay markers on the playing surface. You do get dot markers on the side though. The frets themselves are medium nickel frets, and they actually come from the factory polished on these reissues, which is a nice touch. Rough frets are always sort of a drag. The fretboard connects to the body at the 12th fret, and this is actually a variation that I'm very pleased that Framus reproduced here. If you look here, you'll notice that there's a very tiny end fret, which is actually the same as what John Lennon had on his guitar. Some vintage Hootenannys have an extended neck, which leads to a somewhat elongated fretboard by the sound hole. The top of the guitar, like I said, is Sitka spruce, and the back and sides are mahogany, just like the originals. This model here is the natural finish option in nitrocellulose, but Framus is offering these reissues with several choices. You can get them in either sunburst or natural, which they call vintage tinted, and either of these options can come in satin, high gloss poly, or nitro, which is slightly more expensive. They're also offering these in 6 and 12-string versions, so in total there are 12 variations to choose from. As far as pricing goes, they range from €899 to €1,099, but at time of writing, Tommen's pricing for this range goes from $792 to around $1,050. The sound hole itself was always a very distinctive feature of the Hootenanny due to its veneer rosette. On the originals though, these were actually individually hand-laid pieces of wood, which means no two are exactly alike. They're absolutely gorgeous, and they almost have a sunray pattern. These modern ones still retain this stylish design, but there are fewer individual pieces in the rosette, so it is a bit less defined. Remember, these reissues are not handmade in Germany like the originals. They are factory produced in China, so you cannot expect the same level of individuality fused into each guitar. The pickguard on these reissues was another area of concern for fans because in most of the promo photos, it has a black guard instead of being tortoiseshell like John Lennon's. That being said, I am happy to report that these reissue guitars are being shipped without a pickguard attached, and both a black and tortoiseshell guard are included in the case. All you'll need to do is attach it yourself, as you can see me doing here. I will say that the original Hootenannys had the pickguard screwed in, whereas these reissues are only glued on to the top. Still, I think it was a very nice option that Framus included this for fans because it does avoid the extra step and cost of having to get your own custom pickguard made in this shape. Now I also want to say that I'm actually attaching this with low-tack double-sided tape just for now. There's nothing wrong with the pickguard and it looks great. But I may want to do a video later where I do some vintage style mods, and that would require taking off the pickguard later. I will also say though that these are your standard acoustic guitar pickguards, meaning that they're somewhat flexible and they're really just meant to stick right on. But I will say that the guard that they give you is totally fine. It has nice peel and stick backing from 3M, so you can just peel it and stick it right on if that's what you want to do. Now, like I said before, this pickguard I attached with just some low-tack double-sided tape. I have some mods that I have in mind, and I think I'm going to have a different pickguard made that is sort of more close to the originals. But that being said, this pickguard is totally serviceable. It's one of those printed pattern guards. It's thin, you know, a thin acoustic guard. Don't expect like handmade celluloid resin. You're not going to get that on a pickguard from a factory. You know, those guards cost a lot of money just on their own. So if it was something you want to do, I'm going to do it in the future, so I'll show you how. The bridge is another unique feature of these Framus guitars. It's made of rosewood, and unlike most bridges, the saddle is actually metal. In fact, on the originals, and possibly here too, this is just fret wire, and it adds a lot to the unique tone of these guitars. Reaching the bottom, the tailpiece is probably the most distinctive feature on this guitar. While putting tailpieces on acoustic guitars is kind of a rare sight today, it used to be a very common feature. Many manufacturers did it, and it's because the strings put a lot of pressure on a guitar's top. In order to string it through the bridge, you would need a lot of internal bracing to prevent the top from pulling up or becoming damaged. But using a tailpiece is sort of an easy way to more evenly distribute this tension across the whole instrument and avoid this problem. This is a trapeze-style tailpiece made of nickel, just like the originals, with that unique imprint on the bar. These tailpieces have always been really difficult to find because they have two straight bars. This is the rarer variation, and most models have angled bars here. So I'm very happy that Framus chose to reproduce the rarer straight bar version that is found on John Lennon's guitar. So here's my verdict after playing this guitar for a week or two. It is amazing, okay? I'm just gonna say that off the bat. I know that Framus sent me the instrument, but it has the tone, that 60s unmistakable 12-string acoustic tone that everyone is looking for. And really, I'm very, very impressed with what they've done here. The features that make this instrument so unique have all been faithfully reproduced. When it comes down to it, this is a very niche guitar, and most of the people who buy one are going to be Beatle nuts like me. But what I actually think is more important to consider here is that for a lot of people, including myself, this is sort of the closest that you're ever going to get to a real vintage Framus Hootenanny. The originals are exceptionally rare, and they go for at least $5,000. So I'm a big fan of accessibility, but even for me, before this reissue came out, the Framus Hootenanny was just one Beatle guitar that I had sort of resigned to never have in my stable. So for me, and I think for probably a lot of other people, the fact that this reissue even exists is sort of a dream come true. The build quality is excellent, and I cannot find any cosmetic flaws. I was particularly impressed by the wood grain on this neck, and I also have to say that the mahogany on the back is absolutely stunning. I mean, seriously, just look at this. And you've probably also figured this out by now, but the guitar does come with a very nice hardshell case. And one quick note about the tone, I'd say that these actually have more resonance than the originals. The reason for that is probably because of the pickguard. The pickguard on the originals was, for all intents and purposes, an electric guitar pickguard. It was very thick. This has the result of somewhat deadening the top of an acoustic guitar, and there's a reason why guitar manufacturers don't do this anymore. So what are my nitpicks? Okay, so I really only have a few. It would have been nice for the truss rod cover to be black, and for the pickguard to be Lennon spec right out of the box, but this is sort of hard to complain about when they're a relatively easy fix, and it was really cool of Framus to include a free guard for you. The only structural thing that you can't really mod is the rosette sound hole. And I admit it would have been nice to have that beautiful vintage style rosette with all the little pieces, but again, I understand why this really isn't possible at this price point. It did give me an idea though. If Framus ever did decide to do a handmade German version of this guitar, I can almost guarantee that Beatle fans would buy it in a heartbeat. I mean, look, the reality is this was a relatively affordable guitar for $1,000 in the 1960s when it came out. And I think that we can all agree that it just wouldn't be possible to offer a handmade German instrument for $1,000 in 2025. It's just not possible anymore at that price point. Personally, I'm just thrilled that this reissue came out. I'm really happy with what Framus has done for the Beatles gear community. And honestly, these guitars just have a really unmistakable tone that you can't really find from any other 12-string. That tailpiece adds something truly special. Alright, let's see how this sounds again, and once again, thank you to everybody at the Framus team. Thank you to Hans-Peter, thank you to Swen, thanks to Christian, and of course thank you to Perry for helping with the vintage section. I actually recommend you hop over to his video after this if you want to do a comparison. You can see how these actually sound compared to the original back to back. Alright, thanks for watching, see you next time.